October 1941, as German forces drive relentlessly toward Moscow under Operation Typhoon, their armored spearheads appear unstoppable. But near the small Russian town of Mtsensk, a new Soviet tank emerges from the forests and smoke of the Eastern Front. What follows will shock German commanders and challenge everything they thought they knew about armored warfare. On the 30th October, German forces entered Orel so quickly that Soviet defenses were still trying to organize. The road ahead appeared open, but the Soviet command rushed forward Colonel Mikhail Katukov's 4th Tank Brigade, a formation equipped with T-34s and KV tanks, and ordered it to delay the German advance near Mtsensk, a town northeast of Orel on the road toward Tula. Katukov did not meet the German Panzers in a straight tank charge. Instead, his crews used the terrain: forests, villages, bends in the road, and prepared firing positions. German columns advancing along the road were hit from concealed positions. Then the Soviet tanks withdrew before the Germans could concentrate their fire. For the Germans, the fighting near Mtsensk was a shock. Many of their tank and anti-tank guns struggled against the T-34's sloped armor at normal ranges, while the Soviet 76.2 mm gun could destroy the lighter Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks. On 4th of October, elements of the German 4th Panzer Division suffered a serious setback near Mtsensk, and Guderian later demanded closer study of the T-34 after these encounters. But to understand why Mtsensk mattered, we must first understand the wider situation. By early October 1941, the German invasion of the Soviet Union had already been raging for more than 3 months. The Wehrmacht had taken enormous territory. Soviet armies had been surrounded in huge pockets. German commanders believed that one final blow against Moscow might bring the entire Soviet state to collapse. Operation Typhoon was designed for exactly that purpose. Army Group Center would drive toward Moscow with massive force. In the north and center, German units moved through Vyazma and toward the Mozhaisk defense line. In the south, Guderian's armored forces were to move through Orel and Tula, threatening Moscow from below. At first, the offensive seemed to confirm German confidence. Soviet units were retreating, communications were breaking down, and whole formations were being encircled west of the capital. The German advance on Orel was so fast that it caught the Soviet command off guard. The city fell before a proper defensive line could be created. Yet speed had also created danger for the Germans. Their armored spearheads were moving far ahead of supporting infantry. Supply lines were stretched across damaged roads. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and maintenance were becoming constant problems. The autumn weather was beginning to turn roads into mud, and on the route toward Tula, the Germans were entering terrain that favored ambushes. This was the battlefield into which Katukov's 4th Tank Brigade arrived. It was not a huge formation compared with the German forces pushing toward Moscow, but it had something the Germans were only beginning to understand: the T-34. The T-34 was not a perfect tank. Its early versions had poor crew comfort, limited visibility, and often lacked reliable radios. Soviet crews also suffered from uneven training, and many Red Army formations had already lost vast numbers of tanks during the opening months of the war. But the T-34 had several features that made it dangerous. Its sloped armor increased the chance that incoming rounds would deflect. Its wide tracks gave it better mobility across soft ground, and its 76.2 mm gun gave it the ability to threaten German tanks that had previously dominated the battlefield. For German tank crews used to facing older Soviet machines, the T-34 was different. Against many earlier tanks, German tactics and gunnery had worked with deadly efficiency, but near Mtsensk, the Germans were no longer simply fighting outdated armor in open ground. They were facing modern Soviet tanks concealed in forests and villages, waiting for the right moment to fire. Katukov's method was simple but effective. He avoided presenting his brigade as an easy target. Instead of standing in the open and trading shots with the German advance, he used defensive positions, sudden attacks, and withdrawals. Soviet tanks struck at German columns from the flanks, where armor was weaker and where confusion could spread quickly. German armored columns depended on rhythm. Reconnaissance moved forward. Tanks followed. Motorized infantry, artillery, and supply vehicles came behind. When that rhythm worked, the German advance could move with terrifying speed. But when the lead units were hit unexpectedly, especially on narrow roads or near villages, the entire column could slow down. That was what happened near Mtsensk. The Germans were not destroyed in one single dramatic moment. Instead, they were forced into a series of sharp, costly engagements. Soviet tanks appeared from covered positions, opened fire, and then withdrew. German crews tried to locate them, but the terrain and movement made this difficult. The psychological effect was important. German tank crews had been trained to believe in their tactical superiority. They had defeated enemy armored forces across Europe. They had crossed hundreds of miles of Soviet territory. Now, suddenly they were facing tanks that could survive hits and return fire with devastating effect. In these engagements, the T-34's design began to show its value. Sloped armor meant that a hit did not always mean a kill. German shells that might have destroyed older Soviet tanks could fail against a well-angled T-34. Meanwhile, the Soviet tank's gun gave its crew the power to knock out German vehicles at ranges where the Germans could not always respond effectively. The German 4th Panzer Division was especially affected by these encounters. It had advanced rapidly through Ural and toward Mtsensk, but its progress slowed as Soviet resistance stiffened. What had looked like an open road toward Tula now became a battlefield of woods, smoke, and sudden fire. It is important not to exaggerate the battle. The T-34 did not single-handedly stop Operation Typhoon. German forces continued to push forward after Mtsensk. The Wehrmacht still reached the approaches to Moscow, and the Battle of Moscow would become one of the largest and most desperate struggles of the war. But Mtsensk was significant because it exposed a problem the Germans could not ignore. Their tanks, especially the Panzer III and early Panzer IV models, were not always technically superior to the Soviet machines they were facing. German doctrine and experience were still formidable, but the battlefield had changed. Guderian understood this. After the fighting, he took the T-34 seriously. German reports and later accounts described the shock caused by the tank's armor, firepower, and mobility. The encounters near Mtsensk contributed to a wider German realization. Future German tanks would need stronger guns, better armor, and designs capable of matching Soviet armor on the Eastern Front. The Soviet side also learned from Mtsensk. Katukov's brigade showed that the T-34 could be most effective when used with patience and terrain, not simply thrown forward in mass attacks. The Red Army was still suffering enormous losses in 1941, but commanders like Katukov were beginning to develop methods that made better use of Soviet strengths. The battle also came at a critical moment. Moscow was under threat. Panic was spreading in parts of the Soviet rear. Factories were being evacuated. Civilians were digging defenses. The German army was still advancing, but it was also beginning to lose momentum. Every delay mattered. Around Mtsensk, the German southern thrust toward Tula was slowed. Tula itself would become an important defensive point south of Moscow. The longer Soviet forces could delay Guderian's advance, the more time Moscow had to prepare, reinforce, and survive the coming assault. By late 1941, the German campaign was no longer the clean, fast war Hitler had expected. The roads were failing. The weather was worsening. Soviet resistance was hardening, and the Red Army was still able to bring forward new units, new weapons, and fresh reserves. The T-34 became one symbol of that resistance. It was not invincible, and thousands would be destroyed over the course of the war. German anti-tank guns, mines, artillery, aircraft, and later tanks like the Panther and Tiger would all take a heavy toll. But in October 1941, near Mtsensk, the T-34 helped deliver a warning. The Soviet Union could still fight, its soldiers could still adapt, and its new tank could challenge the armored force that had carried Germany from victory to victory. For the German crews on the road to Tula, this was not just another Soviet counterattack. It was the moment they encountered a machine that changed their understanding of the war in the East. The battle near Mtsensk did not decide the war. It did not save Moscow by itself, but it revealed the future shape of the conflict. A brutal war of machines, production, adaptation, and endurance. Germany had entered Operation Typhoon, hoping for one final victory before winter. Instead, in the forests and villages near Mtsensk, its armored spearheads met the T-34 and discovered that the road to Moscow would not be as easy as they had imagined.